Hey, this is Shondell Joyce. Join me for painting this beautiful bucolic scene in pastel. I always start off by using the rule of thirds and making a value sketch and a color study. This helps me to plan out my paintings and to know which of my pastels I'm going to use. In this case, I'm starting from light to dark and back to front. So I'm putting in the background before I put in any of the detail. That's because the trees, the cows, everything else overlaps what's in the background. So I want to make sure I have it squared away first. So I'm putting in a pretty heavy application of light pastel. It's not pure white, it's a warm white. This version is a little bit warmer, and I'm making the sky a little bit warmer and brighter than the mist that's hanging in the field. Once I have this applied well, then I'm going to take a look at this tree line that's in the back. I'm using a yellow-purple palette, so I want to make sure all my colors are harmonious with yellow and purple. I matched them on the color reference photo first by making a little dot. This is a yellow ochre. It's a cooler yellow ochre, so I'm using it on the horizon and in the distance. On top of it, I'm putting a warmer yellow ochre to show the middle ground. So this helps to create a sense of perspective. Here you can see that the mark making has changed too. I went from very smooth and horizontal along the horizon to vertical and choppy in the foreground. And this helps to create the illusion of texture and perspective. Now, checking the photo reference, I can see that the mist needs to be blended. So I'm using my clean fingers as paintbrushes and just lightly pushing the pastel into the tooth of the ampersand pastel board. This helps me to soften the mist and to get it behind the field and the objects. I'm also softening the horizon so it doesn't look like such a hard architectural line in the distance. This helps bring the cows forward, put the trees on top of the background, and create that illusion of perspective. Now for the trees, I'm going to make these shapes a little different, so I'm changing up my color and my mark making. The colors for these trees are going to be more in the purple range. I don't want them to be too dark, so I'm going to bring in some colors that are a little bit cooler versions of blue violet. So this is an intense Mount Vision violet. It's soft, and I'm making some vertical motions. The part that's on blank surface comes off very intense and highly chromatic. The part that's on top in the mist is a little softer. I'm putting a warmer version of that violet, which is a red violet, near where the sun is peeking through the mist. I'm connecting the two with a cooler blue violet. You can see it's just a touch cooler than the violet I used, and I'm going to use it for the trees in the distance. So having a little more blue or cool will help push that towards the back. And the further back I go, the lighter I'm going to make those trees. So the ones in the very far distance are much lighter and bluer than the ones that are in the middle ground. On top of this, I'm adding some texture and marks to create the illusion of foliage. That helps to push the tree forward and to make it look bigger and more in the middle ground. Next, I'm going to soften and combine these by using just a single finger. This helps to create that texture, soften some of the edges. If you have a hard time with it, you can also use a soft paintbrush. I personally would rather use a finger because you can get a feel for it, an intuitive feel for just how much pressure to put down and how much to blend. When you're using an instrument, it's far less tactile. Now I'm just lightly touching those trees at the bottom and at the top so that they look a little hazy, a little muted, and partially blended into the background. Already you can get a feel for how they're sitting behind the cow, and creating that illusion of perspective that I'm looking for. You don't see so much of the trees in the reference photo, but I can use my imagination and make them appear. I'm adding a little break in the trees here. I want some of that golden sunlight and mist to pour right behind the cow, the second cow, and into the field in front of the tree. I'm breaking up the line of the tree with some sky holes and creating some lacy texture where the tree overlaps the sky. Now they're starting to look more like tree shapes. On top of this, I'm using some of that beautiful golden yellow ochre and bringing a little bit of it into the mist. This is the last brighter, warmer version of yellow ochre, and it helps to soften the edge, push the trees back, and create more of a misty feel. I'm also putting a little bit of warm on top of the violet and adding a little more texture to the field and the grasses. This is the same color yellow ochre, but it happens to have a little mica in it, which creates iridescence. Nothing is prettier on mist than having just a touch of iridescence. I don't use it everywhere. Here you can see that there's texture in the foreground on those grasses. I want to get some of the texture in because this is the next layer. If I'm working from the back to the front, I've finished everything in the back. Now I'm working on the middle ground. Part of the middle ground is the bits of dirt in the field as well as around the cows. For this, I'm using a warmer violet color. This has a bit of a gray to it, so it helps to soften the violet. On top of it, I'm adding some yellow ochre and creating texture so that the bits of grasses that are in the middle ground closer to us are taller and wider and have more texture than the ones towards the middle and the back. Now we have a sense of perspective and the field is beginning to lay down instead of looking like a flat shape. I haven't done anything to the cows, but because I'm working on an ampersand pastel board that's already gray, you get a sense of the color of the cows and the shape of the cows coming through. I'm still putting in some of the grasses, some of the straw, and I'm breaking up the cast shadow of the cow that's in the distance. Doesn't really look like a cow yet, but it will. I'm going to soften, just lightly touch. I don't want there to be too much texture in the middle ground. I want to save some of my best mark making for the grasses in the foreground. I'm using a lighter version of yellow ochre, and this gives some highlight and texture to the grasses. Now you have a sense of color harmony with the yellow-purple palette. The painting is beginning to take shape. The next part that I'm going to focus on is going to be the cows themselves. So looking at the reference photo, I can see that the cows are backlit. The cast shadow behind the smaller cow, or the cow that's more distant, shows you where the light is coming from. So I'm going to start off with that cow and practice. Whenever I'm painting something that requires a little more detail, I try to practice it first, either with a color study or by doing a smaller version and then building up on top of it. Here's two purples. One is a more normal violet. The other is a red violet, which is warmer. So I'm using that more violet color for the cow that's towards the back. I don't want it to pop too much. I want most of the colors on it to be cool so that it recedes. I'm breaking up some of the shapes of the cow so that you get a feel for the legs and the body. And I'm negative space painting some of the grasses between the legs and over the shadow so that the cow becomes a separate entity in the field. It's just a few little marks, but when you look at it from a distance, it reads like a cow. You don't have to spell it out for viewers, and it's actually better if you don't. People enjoy the concept of closure, of using their imagination and making it being part of the art making process by making it up as they go. All right. Now I'm putting in a few highlights. I'm not using anything that's going to show up too brightly on this cow because it's backlit. I'm just making sure that it stands out as a hard edge against the lost edges of the fog and the mist. I'm pretty happy with this cow. It definitely reads like it's in the middle. It's not too far back. So I am using some of the same colors on the cow in front. The only difference is the dark is going to be a little darker and warmer. In this case, I'm using like a chocolate brown, and this will give me some of the shapes on the pattern of the cow's hide. I'm putting in the darks first. In general, I always work from dark to light. The difference is with the landscape. When you're doing a landscape, you will sometimes need to work from the back to the front, as in the case here. But once you have laid in everything that's in the background, you can revert back to the default setting of dark to light. You would do that in all forms of painting except watercolor. So now I've got the pattern of darks. The cow is already taking form. I'm going to start putting in some of the shapes of the legs and some of the reflected color up underneath the cow. So using a harder pastel, I give some shape to the tail, to the legs. The reflected color is a warmer version of violet. So I'm using that red violet instead of the true violet that I used on the cow that's in the distance. I test it sometimes on the photo reference before I put it on the painting, just to make sure it's going to work and be harmonious. I really like the sense of reflected light bouncing up on the underside of the cow. If you were standing in a golden field, you would definitely feel or see some of that color bouncing up on your legs. Now I'm going to use some of the true violet towards the middle. This helps to tie it to the other cow. It also creates a sense of being backlit, since we don't see any pure white on this angle. So I'm using this cooler violet color for the light on the back of the cow. This is the same color I used in the mist in the distance. Rarely do I introduce new colors to a painting, because light and color bounce around in a scene. And very often, the colors that you use to set the scene are going to be the same colors on a figure or an animal. So I'm using some of those same blues and blue violets to show some of the light colors on the cow. This is a close-up. It's a white and black Guernsey cow, but I'm not using any true white or black. Both of those colors would deaden the composition. So instead, I'm using juicy colors like violet, different colors of violet, and some different colors, temperatures to help juice it up a little. Pretty happy with those cows. Putting in a few fine details, some highlights on the tail. I always think in terms of planar values, so if the sun is hitting the backside of the cow, it's going to hit the same plane on every part of the cow. So pretty happy with how the light is hitting. I'm going to now start putting in some of the heavy, intense darks. I'm using the same color I used on the cow's back. This is like a deep, dark chocolate color, or a dark violet, which reads like brown in the computer. But if you see it up front, it really looks chocolatey, a little more violet. I don't use neutrals that often unless I have to. If I'm using far too much chroma, I'll use some neutrals, but it's really nice to have a sense of color harmony. I want to make sure that the darkest darks are in the foreground. This gives you the most intense perspective because dark colors come forward, lighter colors recede. So we want every color in the background to be much lighter than what I'm putting in the foreground. These are the fence posts. They're at an odd angle. Why be normal when you can be at an odd angle? I'm also putting in some texture of the grasses. Most of these marks are going to be vertical, straight up and down. So you get a sense that the grasses are tall. They're between us and the cow. Here's two different versions of a mauve. One's a little bit warmer, one's a little bit cooler. So I'm starting off with a little bit cooler mauve and making some beautiful vertical marks. This is like an amaranth type of wild grass that you often see hanging around the edges of fields. Here, it's a warm red violet. It goes perfect with a yellow-purple palette because it's a form of purple. So that kind of mauve is a red violet. I'm accenting it with a slightly warmer color in the foreground. This helps to give a sense of some of those flowers being closer to us, some of them being further away. It also helps to break up those flowers and to create some texture. I come back in negative space paint with that yellow ochre and put some highlights on some of the yellow flowers and edges of the straw sticking up between the flowers. I also break up the fence posts and separate them from the grasses, creating nice texture. This is a neutral. The neutral is a greenish violet, like an olive color. It's actually a color you would get if you happen to mix yellow and violet together. I arrange most of my pastels in families according to the complements, along with the colors you would get if you mix them all together. If some of this is new to you and you would like to find out about it and try your hand at painting like this, take one of my online classes. You can find a list of upcoming classes on my website on the online classes page. I go much slower and step by step and help you set out your colors ahead of time based on a complementary palette system. And together we work pastel magic to create beautiful paintings like this. I hope you'll consider joining me. I'm putting the finishing touches on this painting now, which are mainly highlights. Notice I haven't used any pure white. So I'm working my way up to the lightest lights. This is yellow gold. And now I'm putting the lightest light. This is the only little touch of pure white. It's in the absolute foreground, and it really helps to separate the posts and the fence from the cow in the middle ground and the field and mist in the distance. And there you have it, my friends. Thank you for joining me. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on Wednesday night online. Join me. Thank you. Bye-bye.